The year was 1910, and New Orleans was a city caught in the humid embrace of change. Though to a boy like me, barely 10 summers old, it mostly felt like the usual sticky, sweet, and wonderfully loud chaos. We lived in a house on Esplanade Avenue, a grand old dame of a place with peeling paint and iron-lace balconies that whispered stories of a bygone era. My name is Antoine Lafitte, and this, as my grandpère would often sigh, was to be our last Mardi Gras. Not the city's last, mind you, but the Lafitte family's. A pronouncement that hung in the air like the scent of chicory coffee, both bitter and unavoidable. Grand-père Henri, a man whose eyes held the same glint as the copper stills he used to tend, believed in omens. He'd say the streetcar tracks, now scarring the old cobbled streets, were like chains slowly binding the spirit of the city. He'd seen the lights dim in the grand salons, heard the quiet whispers of families selling off ancestral homes. He said our time, the time of the old guard, of the true Creole spirit, was fading like the last notes of a mournful jazz tune drifting from a hidden speakeasy. I didn't fully grasp the weight of his words then. To me, Mardi Gras was a glorious, bewildering spectacle of masks, music, and mountains of sugared beignets. Preparations for Mardi Gras in our house began weeks, even months, before Fat Tuesday. Not like the other families, with their elaborate balls and parades. Our Mardi Gras was a private affair, a ritual passed down through generations. It centered around the attic, a dusty, cavernous space that smelled of cedar and forgotten dreams. Up there, in the dim light filtering through the grimy skylight, lay the remnants of what Grand-père called our heritage. Trunks filled with faded silks, tarnished silver, and masks. Oh, the masks. They weren't just simple disguises, they were works of art. Some carved from wood, others molded from plaster, adorned with feathers from exotic birds and jewels that sparkled even in the gloom. Each mask, Grand-père insisted, held a story, a fragment of a forgotten Mardi Gras when the Lafitte name still held sway. My job, a solemn duty for my young age, was to help Grand-père clean and polish them. He'd carefully lift each one, tracing the contours with his gnarled fingers, his voice a low rumble as he recounted tales of ancestors who wore them. This one, he'd say, holding up a raven-black mask with sharp silver beaks, was worn by Jean-Pierre Lafitte, your great-great-grand-uncle, when he snuck into the governor's ball, pretending to be a visiting dignitary. He danced with the governor's wife for hours, whispering secrets she thought were flirtations, but were truly warnings. I'd listen, mesmerized, imagining the daring feats of these shadowy figures from our past, their lives intertwined with the very fabric of New Orleans. Mother, bless her practical heart, saw the masks differently. To her, they were relics of a bygone extravagance, dust collectors in a house that increasingly struggled to keep its own roof from leaking. She'd often sigh, her hands perpetually busy with mending or cooking. Henri, what good are these old things? We could sell them, you know. They'd fetch a pretty penny. Grand-père would stiffen, his eyes narrowing. Sell our past, Celeste? Sell the very air our ancestors breathed? Never. Their clashes, quiet but persistent, were another sign of the shifting sands beneath our feet. Mother worried about the rent, about my schooling, about the rising cost of rice and beans. Grand-père worried about the soul of the Lafittes, about traditions fading into oblivion. This year, the preparations felt different, though. There was a palpable urgency in Grand-père's movements, a desperate energy in his voice as he spoke of the masks. He insisted we polish every single one, even those too damaged or fragile to be worn. He even pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box, hidden deep within a locked trunk. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay a single plain white mask. It had no feathers, no jewels, no elaborate carvings, just pure, unadorned white. This, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, is the first mask, worn by Jean Lafitte himself before the city knew him as a buccaneer. When he was just a boy, dreaming of freedom, I stared at it, a simple piece of wood. Yet it seemed to hum with untold history. It felt cold to the touch, like something from another time. Why is it so plain, Grand-Père? I asked, my fingers itching to touch it. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. Because, little Antoine, true freedom needs no adornment. It is pure, unblemished, and utterly terrifying in its simplicity. This mask, it represents the beginning. And perhaps, he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing. In the sunlight, it represents the end. My father, Lucien, was a quiet man, a shipping clerk down at the docks. He bore the Lafitte name with a heavy sense of responsibility, but without Grand-Père's romanticism. He worked long hours, his hands calloused, his shoulders perpetually stooped. He rarely spoke of the family's past, focusing instead on the present, on putting food on the table. He'd humor Grand-Père, occasionally helping with a heavy trunk or a stubborn latch, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of a different battle, the daily struggle to survive in a rapidly changing world. He saw the city not through the lens of history, but through the ledger books, the rising prices, the dwindling opportunities. He knew the dream of the Lafittes was, for all intents and purposes, dead. As Mardi Gras drew closer, the city began its transformation. Purple, green, and gold bunting appeared on balconies. Street vendors hawked spicy boudin and sweet pralines, and the air buzzed with an electric anticipation. Even the usual stench of the bayou seemed to sweeten with the promise of revelry. But inside our house, a quiet tension brewed. Grand-Père, fueled by some internal fire, was meticulously planning our last grand gesture. He spoke of a secret procession, a final unannounced appearance of the Lafitte masks, worn not for revelry but for remembrance. Mother worried about the repercussions, about drawing unwanted attention, about the family's already precarious standing. Father simply watched, his silence louder than any argument. He, too, felt the shift. The usual childish excitement for Mardi Gras was tinged with something else, a melancholic understanding that this year was different. Grand-Père's urgency was contagious. I found myself poring over old maps of the French Quarter, maps Grand-Père had marked with faded ink, showing routes and hidden courtyards, places where, he claimed, the true spirit of New Orleans still resided, untouched by modern hands. He spoke of secret passages, of forgotten waterways, of places only a Lafitte would know. I imagined myself a young buccaneer navigating a labyrinth of history, uncovering forgotten treasures. One afternoon, Grand-Père pulled out an old leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and yellowed. The script was cramped and faded, almost illegible in places. "This," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is Jean Lafitte's own, his observations, his dreams, his regrets." He flipped through it carefully, pointing to a rough sketch of a mask, remarkably similar to the plain white one we'd just polished. Below it, a single line of French, barely decipherable. "La fin n'est jamais la fin." The end is never the end. He tapped the page. He knew, Antoine. He knew that even when things seem to conclude, something new begins. Our Mardi Gras may be ending, but the spirit of the Lafittes, the spirit of New Orleans, it endures. We simply need to find its new vessel. I didn't quite understand the philosophical depth of his words, but the idea of a secret journal, of hidden meanings, thrilled me. It made the impending Mardi Gras feel less like an ending and more like a grand, mysterious adventure. Grand-Père began outlining his plan for our final procession. It wouldn't be like the grand parades of the crews, with their elaborate floats and booming bands. Ours would be quiet, almost ghost-like. A small group, wearing the old Lafitte masks, traversing the forgotten alleys and hidden courtyards, a silent tribute to a fading era. He spoke of a specific route, one that would take us past landmarks he considered sacred, places steeped in Lafitte history, a crumbling warehouse where contraband was once stored, a secluded fountain where lovers secretly met, a forgotten graveyard where ancestors lay buried beneath moss-draped oak trees. Mother, predictably, was horrified. "Henri, are you mad? Walking through the quarter at night in those ridiculous masks? You'll be arrested, or worse, mistaken for common ruffians." Grandpère merely smiled, a rare, almost mischievous glint in his eyes. "Let them mistake us, Celeste. Let them wonder. That is the essence of Mardi Gras, is it not? To be seen and not known, to be present and yet invisible." Father, for once, broke his silence. "Henri," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "the times have changed. The city watches. The authorities are not as forgiving as they once were." "And when?" Grandpère shot back, his voice rising. "Have the Lafittes ever sought forgiveness? We seek only to remember, to honor, to live." The argument settled into a tense silence, the air thick with unspoken words. I knew then, with a child's instinctive understanding, that this Mardi Gras, this last Mardi Gras, would be etched into my memory forever, a turning point not just for our family, but for me. I wondered what secrets the old masks would reveal, and what the future would hold beyond the last parade. I found myself strangely excited, a nervous flutter in my stomach, like the wings of a trapped hummingbird. It wasn't just fear, it was the thrill of the unknown, the allure of a history, about to unfold or perhaps finally unravel. The week leading up to Fat Tuesday was a blur of activity, a frantic dance between Grandpère's historical obsessions and Mother's grounded anxieties. Every day after my lessons with a kindly but perpetually tired tutor who smelled faintly of stale tobacco, I'd rush to the attic. Grandpère would be there surrounded by his treasures, humming old Creole tunes under his breath. He'd unfurl maps, ancient and brittle, tracing routes through the French Quarter with a finger stained with the dust of centuries. "Here," he'd point to a crisscross of lines, "a passage known only to the original Lafittes. It leads from the back of the old apothecary through a hidden courtyard and emerges near the market, perfect for a swift, unseen departure." My imagination would soar, picturing cloak and dagger escapades, secret meetings, and whispered plans. He'd also begun to train me. Not in the art of sword fighting, as I secretly hoped, but in something far more practical for our mission: the art of observation. "A true Lafitte," he'd say, "sees what others overlook, listens to the whispers between the gusts of wind, knows the pulse of the city." He'd send me down to the streets, tasks disguised as errands. "Antoine, go to the market. Observe the new varieties of citrus. But also, tell me, how many streetcars pass by the old iron balcony on Chartres Street between noon and 1 o'clock? I'd return, diligently reporting on both the price of oranges and the frequency of the noisy streetcars. He was mapping the modern city, trying to find its weak points, its blind spots, where our silent procession could pass unnoticed. Mother, meanwhile, had begun to hover. Her usual bustling energy was now laced with a nervous tension. She'd find Grandpère and me in the attic, her hands on her hips, a worried frown etched on her face. "Henri, have you considered the weather? What if it rains? These silks will be ruined. And Antoine, you'll catch your death." Grandpère would simply wave a dismissive hand. "A little rain only adds to the mystery, Celeste, and the spirit of a Lafitte is not dampened by mere moisture." He'd say this with a theatrical flourish, as if to invoke the very ghosts of our ancestors. Father, though still mostly silent, began to show his concern in small, almost imperceptible ways. He'd return from the docks later than usual, his face more drawn. I'd sometimes catch him watching Grandpère, a complex mix of exasperation and weary affection in his gaze. One evening, I overheard him speaking quietly to Mother in the kitchen, the low murmur of their voices barely audible over the clatter of pots. "He's becoming fervent, Celeste. I worry he'll do something rash, something that will truly bring unwanted attention upon us." Mother's reply was a tired sigh. "What can we do, Lucien? You know how he is when he gets an idea in his head. He believes this is destiny." Despite their worries, a part of me, the part that still believed in adventure and untold stories, was thrilling with anticipation. Grandpère was like a conductor orchestrating a secret symphony, and I was his eager first chair. He taught me the exact timing to cross certain intersections when the gas lamps flickered and cast deeper shadows, when the revelers' laughter was loudest, providing a natural curtain of sound. He spoke of the moon, its phases, and how its light, or lack thereof, would be our ally. He even had me practice walking silently, barefoot on the creaking floorboards, until I could move like a phantom. A Lafitte leaves no trace, Antoine. Only an impression. The costumes were nearing completion. Mother, with her usual meticulousness, had transformed the faded fabrics into garments that, while antique, still held a regal air. My own costume was a small, dark velvet cloak, a miniature version of Grandpère's, and a simple, unadorned black mask that felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. Grandpère had chosen the masks for each of us. Mother was to wear a delicate, silver filigree mask, intricate and elegant, but with a hint of sorrow in its lines. Father's was a plain, sturdy leather mask, practical and unassuming, mirroring his own nature. And for Grandpère himself, he chose the raven black mask with the silver beaks, the one he said his ancestor Jean-Pierre wore. He polished it until it gleamed like a piece of the night sky, its silver beak catching the light with a sharp, predatory glint. The most anticipated moment, however, was when Grandpère brought out the plain white mask, the one he claimed belonged to Jean, Lafitte himself. He handled it with reverence, as if it were a fragile bird. "This," he announced, his voice hushed, "will be mine. A final salute." I understood then that this wasn't just about a procession. It was about Grandpère reclaiming something, embodying a spirit that he felt was slipping away. The irony wasn't lost on me even then, that the man who railed against the city's changes would rely on its enduring shadows to make his last stand. Days turned into hours, and the energy in New Orleans reached a fever pitch. The scent of magnolias and stale beer mingled with the joyous strains of brass bands. Windows were thrown open, revealing glimpses of elaborate costumes and shimmering gowns. The streets vibrated with anticipation. Our house, however, remained, a quiet island in this sea of revelry, the silence amplifying the tension within. Mother was now constantly on edge, jumping at every loud noise, her hands twisting her apron. Father would return from work, his face a mask of exhaustion, and retreat to his study, the sound of his pen scratching against paper the only sound for hours. On the eve of Mardi Gras, Grandpère gathered us in the parlor, the gaslight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He laid out the maps one last time, his finger tracing our intended route. "We will depart at midnight, when the city is at its most unseeing, its most vulnerable. We will walk the old paths, the paths that remember us, and we will remind New Orleans who the Lafittes were." He spoke with a quiet intensity that brooked no argument. Even Mother seemed to fall silent, her usual protests replaced by a resigned apprehension. I remember the chill in the air that night, a damp, heavy stillness that hinted at rain. The distant murmur of the city, usually a comforting lull, felt like a predatory growl. Grandpère had us dress in silence, the rustle of velvet and the click of buckles echoing in the hushed house. My small heart thumped against my ribs like a frantic drum. When Grandpère finally donned the plain white mask, he transformed. The familiar lines of his face disappeared, replaced by the blank, almost eerie smoothness of the wood. His eyes, usually so expressive, became two dark, unreadable slits. He was no longer just Grand-Père Henri. He was, for a moment, the ghost of Jean Lafitte himself. Mother, her hands trembling slightly, tied the ribbons of her silver mask. It covered her entire face, leaving only her mouth visible, a thin, worried line. Father, surprisingly, seemed to straighten a little as he put on his leather mask. It gave his usually gentle features a grim, determined cast. And I, as I put on my small black mask, felt a strange sense of power. I was no longer just Antoine, the small boy. I was part of something larger, something secret and ancient. The world outside the mask seemed to shrink, and the world within, the world of our Lafitte legacy, expanded. Before we left, Grandpère produced a small velvet pouch. He emptied its contents onto the polished mahogany table, a handful of old, tarnished doubloons. They clinked softly, each coin bearing the faded image of a foreign king. "These," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, "were passed down. From Jean, a final offering." He handed one to each of us. The metal felt cold and heavy in my palm, a tangible link to a past I barely knew but was now inextricably bound to. Mother looked at her doubloon, then at Father, a flicker of despair in her eyes. Father simply pocketed his jaw set. Grand-Père had a specific order for our procession. He would lead, wearing the white mask, a beacon into the historical night. I was to follow directly behind him, his shadow, learning to navigate the hidden passages and the unseen dangers. Then came Mother and Father, their masked figures a quiet, mournful support. We were to move slowly, deliberately, like specters, revisiting old haunts. There would be no speaking, no grand declarations, only the soft shuffle of our shoes on the cobbled streets, and the unspoken weight of our purpose. Just as we were about to step out the door, the first drops of rain began. To fall, soft at first, then rapidly growing heavier, splattering against the windows. Mother instinctively reached out as if to pull us back, but Grand-Père merely paused, a faint smile visible through the eye holes of his mask. "See, Celeste," he murmured, his voice echoing slightly behind the wood. "The city weeps with us. A fitting farewell." And with that, he pushed open the heavy oak door, and we stepped out into the humid, rain-slicked New Orleans night, a silent parade of ghosts about to make their final stand. The streetlights blurred through the rain, casting long, distorted shadows, and the distant sounds of merriment felt miles away, belonging to a world we were leaving behind, a world that no longer understood the quiet reverence of a family's last Mardi Gras. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a strange, potent perfume for our solemn journey. The rain was a cold, insistent drumming on the cobbled streets, washing the vibrant colors of Mardi Gras into a muted blur. Each drop felt like a tiny hammer strike, reminding me of the seriousness of our undertaking. Grand-Père, a ghostly figure, in his plain white mask, led the way, his steps surprisingly agile for a man his age. I followed close behind, my small black mask obscuring my vision just enough to make the familiar streets feel new, mysterious, and a little frightening. The world outside the mask was a kaleidoscope of distorted shapes and shimmering lights, while the world within was hushed, dominated by the rhythmic splash of our shoes in puddles and the insistent beat of my own heart. We walked deeper into the French Quarter, away from the grand avenues where the main parades would soon begin. Grand-Père navigated with an uncanny certainty, turning down narrow, shadowy alleys that I'd never noticed before. even though I'd lived in the city my whole life. These were the true veins of New Orleans, he'd always said, the forgotten, arteries that held the city's deepest secrets. The air in these passages was thick with the smell of damp brick, decay, and the faint, sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine that seemed to defy the rain. Every now and then, a gust of wind would whip through, carrying with it the distant, muffled strains of a brass band or the joyous shouts of early revelers, a stark contrast to our solemn procession. Mother and father followed, their masked forms, silent shadows against the gas-lit walls. I could sense Mother's apprehension, a palpable tension in the air around her, even though her mask hid her expression. Father, however, seemed to have found a strange resolve in his anonymity. His steps were steady, and he held his head a little higher than usual. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of the adventurous spirit grand-père so often spoke of in our family's history, a spark in his usually weary demeanor. Our first stop was a crumbling stone wall, barely visible behind a tangle of overgrown vines. Grandpère stopped, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. He reached out and touched a particular stone, worn smooth by time and weather. "Here," he whispered, his voice oddly amplified by the mask. "They say Jean Lafitte himself once concealed a message for his comrades, hidden in the mortar." He ran his fingers along the crack, then glanced back at me, his masked eyes seemingly urging me to feel the history pulsating beneath my fingertips. I imagined desperate hands, hastily pushing a scroll into the damp stone, the urgency of a secret message under the cover of night. We continued our silent journey. The rain intensified, turning the cobblestones into slick, dark mirrors, reflecting the blurred halos of the gaslights. We passed through a dimly lit courtyard, its central fountain a gurgling presence in the darkness. "The Fountain of Whispers," Grandpère murmured, his voice a low hum. "Lovers used to meet here, exchanging vows and secrets under the cover of night. Every drop of water carries a piece of their longing." He lingered for a moment, and I imagined faint echoes of laughter and hushed confessions rising from the water, swirling with the rain. The route took us past old Creole townhouses, their windows dark and shuttered, hinting at sleeping occupants blissfully unaware of the masked figures passing by. Sometimes a curtain would twitch, or a faint light would glow from an upper window, and I'd hold my breath, convinced we'd been seen. But Grandpère simply continued, unwavering, as if our invisibility was guaranteed by the very force of his will. He seemed to know every crack in the pavement, every loose brick, every leaning lamppost. He was moving through a city that existed only for him, a city of memory and legend. The silence of our procession was profound, broken only by the rain and our footsteps. It was a silence that amplified every other sound, the distant clatter of a carriage, the mournful hoot of an owl from a hidden garden, the drip, drip, drip of water from overhanging eaves. My senses were heightened. The sense of coffee, stale beer, and damp earth filled my nostrils. The cool, wet air brushed against my exposed skin. I felt truly alive, part of something momentous and deeply secret. Suddenly, Grandpère paused before an old, dilapidated building, its wooden shutters hanging askew, its paint long since peeled away. It looked abandoned, forlorn. "The old apothecary," he stated, his voice devoid of his usual romanticism. "It once held remedies, cures for all ills. Now it holds only dust and forgotten promises." He pushed open a small, barely visible side door, which creaked loudly, disturbing the solemn quiet. The interior was pitch black, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and ancient medicines. Mother gasped softly, a faint sound of protest behind her mask. Father put a reassuring hand on her arm. Grandpère beckoned us inside, and we stepped into the oppressive darkness. I stumbled on something unseen, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The doubloon in my pocket felt strangely warm against my leg, a small comfort in the looming darkness. Grandpere pulled a small shielded lantern from beneath his cloak, and its weak beam cut through the gloom, revealing shelves lined with dusty, empty bottles and cobweb-draped jars. The shadows danced, making the empty room seem alive with unseen presences. "This," Grandpere said, his voice echoing eerily in the confined space, "is where Jean would meet his most trusted confidants, where plans were forged and futures decided. And through here," he gestured to a narrow opening at the back, almost entirely hidden by stacked crates. It was a passage so small I had to duck my head to enter. The air in the passage was even colder, damper, and smelled of the earth itself. It was clearly an old, unused tunnel, probably part of the building's original foundation, long since forgotten by its current owners. We emerged into another hidden courtyard, even more secluded than the last. This one was entirely surrounded by tall, moss-covered brick walls, and in its center stood a single ancient oak tree, its branches stretching like skeletal arms against the night sky. The rain seemed to fall more softly here, absorbed by the thick canopy of leaves. It was a place of profound stillness, a pocket of forgotten time in the heart of the bustling city. "This is where Jean would come to think," Grandpere whispered, his voice resonating with a deep reverence. "To plan his next move, to escape the noise of the world, and simply be." He walked to the base of the tree and ran his hand over the gnarled bark, as if communing with an old friend. I looked up at the vast, sprawling branches, imagining Jean Lafitte, a man of legend, standing beneath them, his mind churning with grand schemes and daring escapades. The history wasn't just in the masks or the stories. It was in the very ground we stood on, the air we breathed. This was more than just a walk. It was a pilgrimage, a journey back through the layers of time to the very core of what it meant to be a Lafitte. The silence here was different from the silence of the streets. It was not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, meaningful quiet, a quiet that held the weight of centuries. My family stood together, masked and silent, under the ancient oak. For the first time, I felt a deep, unspoken connection to Grandpere's obsession, a sense that we were not just walking through history, but were, in some profound way, part of it. The rain continued its steady patter, a gentle accompaniment to our shared, silent vigil, marking the passage of moments that felt both fleeting and eternal. The old oak seemed to breathe with us, its leaves rustling softly, as if whispering, ancient tales of buccaneers and rebels, of secrets buried deep within the soil.